Hello everyone. In today's session on IT Heroes, we're going to go through the process of a clean install of Windows Server 2016 on a Hyper-V virtual machine. Now this is Windows 10 client-side Hyper-V, and you can see here this is just a basic virtual machine window that is on the screen at the moment. I'm calling this print server right now because I'm potentially going to be turning this virtual machine into a print server for some future videos, but in the particular situation today and just going through and installing the operating system, its future purpose isn't terribly relevant unless you were to take into consideration if you wanted it to be with or without the GUI, but that's of course an option that we will get to as we start up the setup wizard here in just a couple minutes. But we're going to go through from the very beginning of an empty virtual machine that I have created in Hyper-V. We're going to mount the operating system ISO for this machine and simply go through the Windows Server install process step by step up to the point where we get to the startup wizard and all the way through to the desktop. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get underway with this. Our very first step, of course, is we need to load the operating system ISO. There are a couple of ways to go through and actually deploy operating systems to virtual machines. In my particular environment, or at least in this particular situation here, I'm going to go ahead and just use an ISO file that I have for Windows Server 2016. ISOs are available to download from Microsoft. You can simply just perform a search on Google to be able to find ISOs of the different operating systems. Licensing is a whole other story all in itself. I'm not going to be covering anything about licensing on this channel, as that is a topic to simply understand, study, and consult with Microsoft about to make sure that you are following licensing guidelines. This channel is primarily just going to be focusing on the technical, the how-to, the how not to, and of course all the details in between of all of that. So we have our ISO mounted for the virtual machine, and I'm going to go ahead and start it up now. Because this is a blank and empty virtual machine, it is just going to go through and immediately boot right into that ISO here. It's not going to prompt about press any key to start or anything like that. You would get that in the case that the hard drive for the virtual machine, or if you were doing this on a physical machine, of course, the process is about the same. But if there was some kind of a bootable partition already on the hard drive of the machine, then the Windows setup is smart enough to recognize that there is another boot partition, and it would basically do the little ... message is press any key to start the setup wizard. In this case here, and in any case where the hard drive is empty, then it's simply going to immediately start up that wizard, and we're going to be brought over to this screen here. Now, of course, we are, or at least I am, based in the United States, and I speak English, so everything on this first screen I'm going to leave as is and go ahead and click Next. And I'm going to click the Install Now button. In the case that you needed to do an operating system repair or other different options, there is the repair your computer option here as well, but that is a topic all in itself that we're not going to be covering today. We're going to be just doing a clean install of the operating system, so the Install Now button is our obvious choice here. Now here, I'm going to go ahead and choose this option here if I don't have a product key. And to be honest, I actually always recommend in all situations choosing the option here if I don't have a product key. And the main reason for that being is it is simply much easier to go through and license the software after you've gone through, installed, make sure that everything worked as designed, and then simply later go back and put in that product key. So I prefer just to not put in the product key now because I don't want it to go through and register this with a product key and then it take up that license and have to reactivate, or who knows what consequences in the case where something doesn't go right with this install. So I'm going to choose the option there if I don't have the product key, and we are now brought over to our install options. Now, depending on the edition of the operating system, what licensing you have, what ISO that you have, there's any number of different reasons why you might see some different options on this screen. But the primary difference is between, say, for example, the Windows Server 2016 Standard and the Windows Server 2016 Data Center is going to be your license. So Data Center is licensed for additional CPUs that are allowed for the server, as well as potentially some other features. Again, licensing is a topic all in itself. I strongly recommend consulting Microsoft documentation about licensing before going through and actually purchasing a license or anything like that, to make sure that you are getting what you need, and not to mention make sure you're not overspending and purchasing a data center license, for example, when everything that you need can be done with a standard license. Another option you'll see here is this desktop experience option. And this is the difference between installing a server core operating system, where you basically have nothing but a command prompt and your services and everything all are just running in the background, compared to a desktop experience that gives you the whole shell, GUI, start menu, and everything like that. In our case here, just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and install the desktop experience, but depending on your needs, that core install is more secure and has a smaller footprint, so do consider that for production environments, as that could be advantageous for you. We're going to select standard with the desktop experience here, as that's all that I will need for this. We're going to accept our license terms. And then we get over to this screen right here. If we had anything on this hard drive already, I could consider choosing the upgrade option here and upgrading to a previous version of the operating system. Say if there was server 2012 on here, I wanted to upgrade to 2016, or a couple different scenarios. However, in our case here, this is a brand new virtual machine, so we're just doing the install Windows only option, the second option there. You can see that I have just a drive 0 and allocated space. We could go through the process of creating a partition ourselves here if we wanted to limit this down to a specific size or configure this differently than the defaults. However, I'm okay with the operating system simply setting up its default partitioning and formatting of this drive right here. So I'm simply going to click next, and it's going to go through and handle all of that just on its own. So we are now to the actual meat and potatoes of the install process here. This is where it's going to go through and unpack the files that you have on your ISO file, expand it into the image here, and actually begin deploying files, installing software, and then of course getting into the portions there of the installing features and everything else as part of this wizard. And in the end, once we actually complete this whole wizard here, is it's going to bring us over to the welcome screen, where we have to answer a whole ton of questions that Microsoft has deemed necessary for us to answer during every operating system install. That being said, there are ways called unattended installs where you can go through and perform this entire process through with a pre-configured file that answers all of these questions for you, including every question that we just answered about partitioning the hard drive, what type of install to do. I strongly recommend investigating and researching a topic of unattended installs. It might be something we cover in a future video on this channel, as the power of being able to do an unattended install is really quite nice, because if you are doing a multitude of different server installs, or who knows what kind of project that you're working on, if you needed to install Windows on 100 different servers, going through this wizard 100 times is pretty time consuming, pretty tedious, and probably by the end of it at least, pretty frustrating. If you have an unattended install file that you could use in conjunction with your ISO, what that would do is you would actually trigger the install. It would read that unattended file that you create, and it would answer all those questions for you. And effectively, all you just need to do is boot up the setup wizard, and it will proceed with the rest of the steps completely on its own. There are, of course, more technical and full-featured methods of deploying an operating system outside of just a basic ISO install like what we're doing here today. There are options such as Windows Deployment Services, which allows you to deploy Windows operating systems from a network source directly to machines. There's also tons of third-party applications out there that support the remote installation and network installation and other methodologies of going through and installing Windows that are a little bit more complicated to set up initially, but significantly streamline the process. So just keep that in mind. Our process here today is just going through the basic install process of Windows Server 2016. In larger scale environments and corporate environments, especially in large Microsoft Active Directory environments, setting up some kind of a deployment solution that allows you to basically handle this in bulk is definitely a very good idea. You will save yourself a lot of time and trouble. So I went ahead and just allowed the wizard to continue completely. It's on its own there. Once it got to that 10-second point, I could have been fast and clicked that button and immediately restarted things, but it doesn't take very long for this process to really go through and complete all of its steps. Now, you'll see here, press any key to boot from CD or DVD. The reason we're getting that now and we weren't before is the operating system setup has gone through partitioned our hard drive, formatted it, set the boot partition up there, and now when it recognizes that the ISO is in the drive for this virtual machine, it sees that there's that bootable partition, which is why it gives us the option to boot to the ISO again or from the hard drive. Now, with Windows actually installed on the hard drive, we are booting into the hard drive, and we're into the actual setup wizard for Windows Server 2016. Our very first step, of course, is we need to establish a password for our administrator account. So I will go ahead and put that in now. And we'll click Finish here. Finalizing our settings. Of course, my virtual machine now wants me to establish a resolution to it. I'll just accept what it's asking for here. And there we are. We are prepared and ready to log into our virtual machine, running a brand new install of Windows Server 2016. It is really as simple as that. A lot of people assume that the installation of operating systems is a more complicated process than it is. Now, that being said, modern operating system installs are greatly streamlined, simplified, and it's a complete world of difference compared to things way back in the day. I remember doing operating system installs of Windows 98 where we had to go into command line and actually go through and there wasn't even disk part back then. We had F-disk way back in those days. You had to use F-disk and format your drives and go through and set everything up before Windows would even allow you to proceed into the install wizard. And that install wizard for Windows 98 and other operating systems, we had some compatibility issues, sometimes just getting that install wizard to load. So nowadays, installing operating systems is a very, very simple process. It honestly really is. What you do with things afterwards, that's where things can get a little bit more tricky, especially in the case of if we were to choose that option that did not include desktop experience when we were selecting our options at the beginning of this install wizard. If we chose the option that did not include the desktop experience, we actually wouldn't see any of the windows in front of us right now. We wouldn't see this server manager window or anything else. Instead, that actually only allows for command line access and some basic management consoles. So no start menu, no Internet Explorer options, none of the things we see here we're used to with the GUI. So keep that in mind if you do not install your desktop experience. Make sure you are familiar with how to use a Windows Server Core version to administer your operating system, because otherwise you will end up at nothing but a command prompt and a little bit lost at that point. But here we are. We are at our server manager. Our operating system install is complete. And at this point, if this were an actual physical server, we would probably look into doing drivers and then just making sure that it is set up properly for our network. In the case of a virtual machine here, this would be a good time to make sure that it is getting the network information and IP address that is needed. And then we can proceed with configuring roles and features needed for whatever this server's purpose is going to be. But that's it, folks. That is the complete install process of Windows Server 2016 on a Windows 10 client-side Hyper-V virtual machine. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions or comments, definitely put that down below. And continue being an IT hero and have a great day.